At the family party, my father raised his glass and told me to leave, in front of everyone. The laughter died, the music stopped, and as I stood there, shaking, humiliated, my husband stood up too. The whole room went silent. And what he said next changed everything.
If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Like this story and comment what you think was in that letter. Because by the end, you'll realize not every betrayal happens behind closed doors. Some happen right in front of the people who were supposed to protect you. At the family party, my father raised his glass, then told me to leave, in front of everyone. I stood up in shock, the stem of my wineglass trembling between my fingers. The chandelier light caught the tears I was fighting to hide, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room, cousins, uncles, my mother, even my own sister, was watching a play they'd all secretly rehearsed, except me. But then, my husband stood too, and when he did, the laughter faded into silence, because what he said next silenced even my father. Let me back up. My name is Ellen Smith. I'm 54 years old, and if you'd told me 5 years ago that my family, the people I built my entire world around, would one day turn me into a stranger, I would have laughed. But betrayal has a funny way of creeping in. It doesn't always come crashing through your front door. Sometimes it walks in quietly, disguised as tradition, pride, and family honor. That night was supposed to be my father's 70th birthday, a grand celebration in the same old family estate I grew up in. I'd spent days helping my mother with the arrangements, even though I lived 2 hours away now. I baked the lemon cake, his favorite, just like Mom used to when we were kids. And even though my relationship with my father had always been important, I thought maybe this night could fix a few broken pieces. When I walked into that ballroom, gold drapes, string quartet, laughter echoing off marble walls, I felt like maybe I was part of the family again. My husband, Smith, squeezed my hand and whispered, "Just smile, Ellen. Tonight's about him." He always had that calming presence, steady, warm, unbothered by drama. The kind of man who doesn't raise his voice to prove his point. He just looks at you, and somehow you know he sees everything. Dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation and small laughs. My sister, Claire, sat across the table with that perfect smile of hers, the one that hides everything ugly underneath. Her husband, the golden son-in-law, was bragging about his new firm while my father nodded proudly, sipping his whiskey. And then halfway through dessert, he tapped his spoon against the glass. The sound was sharp, commanding. "Everyone," he said, "before we end the night, there's something I need to say." I smiled instinctively, assuming he was about to thank everyone for coming. But then his eyes met mine, cold, almost rehearsed. "This family," he continued, "has always been built on respect and knowing your place." His gaze didn't waver. Unfortunately, some people seem to have forgotten that. A ripple of whispers passed through the room. Smith's hand tightened on mine. And before I could process it, my father said the words that would slice through me like glass. "Ellen, I think it's best if you leave." For a heartbeat, I didn't move. Didn't breathe. I just stared, trying to make sense of the laughter that had vanished, the stares that refused to meet mine, and the silence that grew heavier by the second. "Dad, what?" My voice barely escaped my throat. He stood taller. "You heard me. You've brought enough shame to this family. We don't need your kind of behavior ruining tonight." My kind of behavior? The phrase echoed like thunder inside me, because just weeks earlier, I'd confronted him about something he didn't expect me to find. A document, buried in an old file at the family accounting office.
The one he said I was too emotional to understand. A document that proved he'd transferred part of my late mother's inheritance, my share, into a hidden account under Claire's name. When I brought it up privately, he brushed it off with, "You always overthink things, Ellen." When I persisted, he stopped answering my calls. And now, at his birthday dinner, in front of everyone, he decided to humiliate me instead, make me look unstable, ungrateful, out of line. The perfect way to shut a daughter up, turn her into a spectacle. The room blurred. I could feel my mother's uneasy glance, the cousins' pitying looks, and Claire's faint smirk. But before I could say anything, before I could even defend myself, Smith's chair scraped against the marble floor. He stood, calm, controlled, and for the first time that night, my father's expression flickered, because Smith wasn't the type to make scenes. He looked around the table, slow, deliberate, and said, "If Ellen leaves, we all leave." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the string quartet had stopped. My father narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" Smith didn't blink. "You heard me. You humiliate my wife in front of your guests, and you think I'll sit here and toast to your name?" He took a step forward. "Not tonight." The room froze. And as he reached into his jacket pocket, my heart stopped because I knew exactly what he was holding. The letter, the one my father never thought I'd find. The one that could destroy everything he'd built. But that's the part no one saw coming. Because that letter wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal. And when the truth came out, it didn't just burn bridges. It burned the entire foundation of what my father called family. The envelope in Smith's hand looked so small, yet every breath in that room seemed to bend around it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The calm in his eyes said everything my father feared. He knew. My father's jaw tightened. "Smith, this is not your business." "Huh, I think it is," Smith replied, sliding the letter from the envelope with a slow precision that made every heartbeat louder. "Because when you chose to humiliate my wife in front of this family, you made it everyone's business." I felt the blood drain from my face. That letter wasn't supposed to be here. Not tonight. Not in this room full of witnesses. It was the copy I'd kept locked away in our home office, the one Smith insisted we hold on to, just in case. And somehow, he'd known tonight would be that case. He unfolded the letter, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers, not from fear, but from fury held too long. He began, his voice steady. "Maybe you should tell everyone what this is before I do." My father's face went pale. Claire shifted in her seat, eyes darting between us. The cousins leaned forward like it was the finale of a play. He said nothing. So Smith read. "Transfer authorization dated April 14th, signed by Thomas Mitchell, transferring the remaining funds of Margaret Mitchell's estate to Claire Hawthorne, citing Ellen Smith as forfeiting her share due to emotional instability and neglect of family duties." The words landed like stones dropped into water. 1, 2, 3 ripples of shock spreading across every face at that table. Smith's voice didn't shake. He kept reading, even as my mother gasped and covered her mouth, even as Claire whispered a desperate, "Dad, stop him!" Attached, Statement of Signature Authentication, signed and approved by Thomas Mitchell. He folded the letter slowly, eyes locked on my father. "I had this verified by a notary yesterday. Your signature matches perfectly, Thomas. So maybe explain to everyone how Ellen was unfit when she was the only one taking care of her mother in her final days." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. I saw it, the momentary flicker in my father's eyes, the fear behind the pride. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally said, "You don't understand what you're talking about. That money was being managed properly." Smith's jaw clenched. "Managed? You mean stolen."
"Watch your tone, son," my father barked, grasping for authority he no longer had. But Smith didn't flinch. He just looked at him the way a man looks at someone who's already lost the battle but hasn't realized it yet. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Respect isn't inherited, Thomas. It's earned. And you lost it the moment you decided to break your daughter instead of face your own greed." The words hit harder than any slap could. My father's hand trembled as he reached for his whiskey glass, but it slipped, spilling amber liquid across the white tablecloth. The stain spread like truth itself, dark, unstoppable. I couldn't move. I just stood there, heart pounding, watching years of silent wounds spill open in front of everyone who'd pretended not to see them. My mother finally spoke, her voice shaking. "Thomas, tell me it's not true." He didn't answer. Claire, desperate now, pushed her chair back. "Dad only did what was best for the family. Ellen always..." "Always what?" I cut in, my voice sharper than I'd planned. "Always asked questions? Always refused to be quiet? You mean that?" For once, she didn't have a rehearsed line. Smith reached for my hand, not to pull me away, but to steady me. His warmth grounded me as I said, "You all thought I'd stay silent forever. But silence doesn't erase the truth. It only delays the storm." And then Smith turned to my father one last time. "You wanted her out of your house tonight? Fine. We'll go. But understand this. Tomorrow morning, every one of your partners, every trustee who's ever signed a check for you, will have a copy of this letter. Because I don't protect thieves, even if they wear the same last name as my wife." Gasps filled the room.
My father's voice cracked. "You wouldn't dare." Smith slipped the letter back into his jacket. "Try me." And with that, he placed a final envelope on the table, sealed, marked with the logo of my father's company. The one thing he didn't know Smith had. "This," Smith said quietly, "is from your former accountant, the one you fired last month for misplacing company funds. He didn't misplace them. He sent us proof." Claire's hand flew to her mouth. My father's eyes widened, not in anger this time, but in terror. I turned to leave, my legs shaking, but my voice steady. "Happy birthday, Dad." As we walked toward the door, I could hear whispers rising behind us. Disbelief, pity, judgment, a perfect chorus of everything I'd lived through in that family. But none of it mattered anymore. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't walking away in shame. I was walking away with power. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, the kind that makes your lungs ache but your heart feel awake. Smith exhaled, finally loosening his grip on my hand. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded. "No, but I will be." He smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You know, Ellen, revenge doesn't always need fire. Sometimes all it takes is truth, spoken in the right room at the right time." I looked back through the glass doors, the glow of the chandelier, the stunned faces, the man who once called himself my father, now drowning in the mess he made. And I realized something. That letter wasn't revenge. It was justice wrapped in paper. But what came next? That would be revenge. Because what my father didn't know yet was that this wasn't the only secret I'd uncovered. He thought losing his reputation would break him. He hadn't seen what was buried beneath his company, or how deep the rot went. And I was done being quiet. The drive home that night felt endless. Rain tapped against the windshield like a whisper that refused to fade. Smith's hand rested on the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw tight, the only sign that he was holding back more than words. Neither of us spoke for nearly an hour. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, thoughtful, the kind that carries the weight of 100 unspoken questions. Finally, Smith said quietly, "He'll try to bury it. You know that, right? The letter, the evidence, he'll twist the story before the sun's up." "I know," I said, staring out the window. The streetlights streaked across the glass like ghosts of the night we just escaped. But what my father didn't know, what even Smith didn't fully realize, was that the letter wasn't the only thing I had. There was something deeper, a second secret. It started 2 months earlier. After my mother's funeral, I couldn't stop thinking about the way her will had been handled, how my father insisted that everything was already taken care of. He said I was too emotional to deal with the paperwork, that I should trust him. But trust had always been a one-way street in our family, paved with guilt and control. So, one morning, when I went to the old accounting office to pick up a forgotten photo album, I saw a file marked with my mother's handwriting. She had labeled it simply, Private, for Ellen. Inside were years of statements, small withdrawals, coded transactions, notes in my father's writing. But there was one page that didn't fit. It was a memo dated 6 months before she died, addressed to her attorney. In the event of my passing, please ensure Ellen receives the remaining 22% company shares. Do not discuss with Thomas until documents are filed. My breath caught. My mother had tried to protect me, to give me a part of the company she helped build from nothing. But those shares had vanished. That's when I knew. My father hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen legacy. And that was the second secret. Proof that he'd forged documents to keep my mother's shares under his control. The night after the party, I spread every paper across our dining table. Receipts, transfers, old letters, a lifetime of deceit laid bare under the dim kitchen light. Smith poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me. His voice was calm, but his eyes were fierce. If this is what I think it is, he could lose everything. He already lost everything that mattered, I said quietly. Now he's just going to realize it. Smith studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Then we do this properly. No shouting matches, no rumors, just truth. Legal, clean, undeniable. He opened his laptop and started typing. Within hours, we had a plan. For the next 2 weeks, my life became a quiet storm. While my father's name still shimmered in newspaper features and charity boards, I sat behind a screen, following trails of numbers that led to places he never thought I'd look. Old accounts in the Cayman Islands, property deeds signed under shell companies, even a falsified charity fund, all under my mother's old trust name. It was almost poetic. The same woman he dismissed as fragile had left behind the very breadcrumbs that would expose him. And I was done being the obedient daughter who looked away. Every night, Smith would find me surrounded by papers, highlighters, and half-finished cups of tea. You should sleep, he'd say. I will, after I finish unmaking him. He'd smile faintly, kiss my forehead, and whisper, You sound just like her. When I finally had everything I needed, I contacted my mother's former lawyer, an elderly man named Mr. Jacobs, who had quietly retired after her death. He remembered me instantly. She always worried this would happen, he said softly. She said, Thomas will try to erase Ellen if he can. Those words cracked something open inside me. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about my mother's voice, the one my father had tried to silence even after she was gone. Mr. Jacobs agreed to help me reopen the estate case, and when he saw the forged signatures, he didn't hesitate. This is criminal, Ellen, not civil. I know, I said. Then let's start the fire.
A week later, the first spark hit. My father's company auditor, the same one who'd ignored my calls for years, received a subpoena. Within days, his partners knew. Within a week, the board demanded an emergency meeting, and within 10 days, my father's empire began to crumble. I didn't watch it happen on TV. I didn't need to. I could feel it, the shift in power, the whispers, the headlines that hinted but never dared to name him. Family betrayal behind Mitchell Holdings scandal, one read. Another, questions arise over missing estate funds. He tried to call me, of course, first once, then twice, then 6 times. I didn't answer. But when the 7th call came, I picked up. His voice was hoarse, desperate. Ellen, you've gone too far. I closed my eyes and said, No, Dad, you did, years ago. There was a long silence. Then he said, almost pleading, You'll destroy everything. I looked out at the rain streaking down the window, the same kind of rain that fell the night of my mother's funeral. Maybe, I said, But at least this time, you'll watch it burn with me." And I hung up. The next morning, Smith walked into the kitchen holding the newspaper. Front page, a photograph of my father leaving the courthouse, pale and hollow. He set it down gently. "You did it." "No," I said, staring at the image. "We did it." But even as satisfaction bloomed somewhere deep in my chest, a shadow lingered. Because revenge doesn't end with exposure. It ends with understanding what you've lost along the way. Smith must have seen it in my face. He said quietly, "You're not your father, Ellen. Don't let him drag you down to where he lives." I nodded, but a part of me wasn't done. Because in one of those offshore accounts, there was a name I didn't recognize, Claire's husband's, and the trail led somewhere darker than I expected. My father hadn't worked alone. And if I wanted true closure, I'd have to confront the last person I ever thought I'd fear, my own sister.
When you think you've faced every betrayal life can throw at you, you forget the quietest ones hurt the most. They don't come with shouts or slammed doors. They come wrapped in a familiar smile, spoken in the voice of someone who once held your hand through nightmares. That's what it felt like when I realized my sister, Claire, wasn't innocent. It started the night after my father's first court hearing. I was sitting in my study, the papers from his account spread across the desk, when Smith placed a new file beside me. "I traced one of the offshore accounts again," he said. "There's a joint signature. Not your father's alone." I frowned. "Whose is it?" He hesitated, watching my face. "Claire's husband. David." For a second, I just stared at the name, my brain refusing to process it. David? The man who'd toasted my father at every family dinner? Who'd called me kiddo with that false affection? Who'd stood by my sister's side while she watched me crumble? What is he doing mixed up in this?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "Money laundering. Small amounts hidden under a charity name, but the signature confirms he knew." I pushed back my chair. If he knew, then Claire knew too. Smith didn't argue. He didn't have to, because deep down, I already knew the truth. My sister had been part of this long before the party. The next morning, I drove to her house. The Mitchell estate, her pride, her fortress, gleamed behind its wrought iron gates. Claire opened the door herself. She looked startled to see me, then masked it with that perfect social smile she'd learned from her father. "Ellen," she said, her tone warm but guarded, "you've made quite a scene this week. Don't pretend you're worried about me. I know, Claire." Her expression faltered. "Know what?" I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "About the money, the offshore accounts, David's signature." For a split second, her face drained of color, then she straightened, smoothing her silk blouse. "Be careful, Ellen. You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," I snapped. "You helped him. You helped Dad hide what belonged to Mom." She crossed her arms. "Mom was dying, Ellen. She wasn't thinking clearly." The room fell silent. Those words? That tone? It was like hearing my father's voice come out of her mouth. I took a slow breath. She was clearer than you'll ever be. Her jaw tightened. "You always think you're the victim, but maybe she didn't trust you with responsibility. Maybe that's why Dad handled everything." I laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Responsibility? Is that what you call stealing?" "Protecting," she said sharply. "Dad built that company. He deserved to keep it intact. And David—" "David?" I interrupted. "David's been helping him move money for years. Don't tell me you didn't know." Her silence was answer enough. Something inside me snapped. Not in anger, in clarity. Because in that moment, standing in the same living room where we'd once played as little girls, I finally saw her for who she'd become. Not a victim, not a sister, an accomplice. "You chose his side," I said softly.
Even after everything he did to Mom. She swallowed hard, looking away. It was never that simple. Yes, I said, turning toward the door. It always was. That night, I couldn't sleep. Smith found me pacing the kitchen, hands shaking. Talk to me, he said gently. She knew. All this time, she knew. He nodded slowly. Then we use that. I looked up at him. Use it how? Expose her too. For a moment, I almost said yes, but then I stopped. No, I said quietly. If I go after her publicly, I'll be no better than him. I need something else, something she'll never forget. Smith studied me, his gaze steady. What are you thinking? Something she can't bury or deny, something that'll make her face what she's done. Over the next week, I set a plan in motion. It started with a dinner invitation, handwritten, delivered by courier, signed only with my initials. E.S. for one last meal as sisters. She came. Of course she did. Curiosity was always her weakness. I'd reserved the private dining room at the same country club where our father used to host his annual family celebrations. The irony wasn't lost on me. When she arrived, she looked immaculate, ivory suit, pearls, not a single hair out of place. But when she saw Smith sitting beside me, her smile faltered. Still bringing back up, I see, she said dryly. I just wanted witnesses, I replied. This isn't about threats, Claire. It's about truth. I slid a brown envelope across the table. Inside were copies of the financial statements, every transfer, every forged document, every offshore account. And at the very top, her husband's signature. She stared at it for a long time. When she finally looked up, her voice trembled just slightly. Where did you get these? I said, from the same place you both thought I'd never check. Mom's old trust. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Smith leaned forward. You can walk away quietly, Claire. Confess, cooperate, and you won't face prison. Or you can keep pretending and drag David and yourself down with him. Claire's composure cracked then. You don't understand, Ellen. He said it was temporary. Dad promised. I cut her off. Dad promised a lot of things. To Mom, to me, to everyone. And look where those promises got us. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. You think you're the hero in this story? No, I said. I'm the consequence. That night, she signed the cooperation documents. By morning, her husband was subpoenaed, and within 48 hours, the story hit every news outlet in the city. Mitchell family scandal deepens. Daughter turns witness in fraud case. My father's empire didn't just crumble after that. It imploded. Shareholders fled. The company was seized for investigation. And the name, Mitchell Holdings, once whispered with pride, became a cautionary tale. A week later, Claire showed up at my house. No pearls this time, not tailored suit, just jeans, a sweater, and eyes that had finally lost their shine. I signed everything, she said softly. It's done. I nodded, waiting. I don't expect forgiveness, she continued. But I needed you to know I didn't do it for money. I did it because I was afraid. He said if we didn't help, he'd cut us off. And after Mom died, I couldn't lose anyone else. Her voice cracked on the last word. For the first time in years, I saw the sister I used to know. Scared, flawed, but human. I stepped closer. You already lost her, Claire. We both did. But you didn't have to lose yourself, too. She wiped her eyes, gave a small, broken laugh. Maybe it's too late for that. Maybe not. But it starts with truth. After she left, Smith wrapped his arms around me. You did it, he murmured. It's over. But as I stared out the window, watching the wind ripple through the trees, I felt something else. Not relief, not victory. A quiet ache. Because when you burn down the house that raised you, even if it was rotten, you still miss the sound of its walls. But it wasn't quite over. A week later, I received a letter,
no return address, just my name typed nicely on the front. Inside was a single line written in my father's hand. "You think this ends with me, Ellen. It doesn't." And tucked beneath it, a photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, standing beside my mother. The back of the photo was dated 1983, and below it, in faded ink, a name I hadn't seen before. Rebecca, my mother's friend. But if what I suspected was true, Rebecca wasn't just her friend. She was something far more dangerous.
When you've spent your whole life surviving betrayal, you start to believe there's nothing left that can surprise you. But pain has layers, and sometimes the deepest one doesn't come from what they did, it comes from what you never knew. That's what the letter taught me. It arrived wrapped in plain brown paper, no return address, only my name written in my father's precise handwriting. Inside it, the photo, my mother, smiling softly beside a woman I'd never seen. On the back, a single word, Rebecca. For 3 days, I left it on my desk untouched, afraid that opening that final door would drag me back into a past I'd already buried. But curiosity, or maybe destiny, doesn't let you rest. So one evening, after Smith had gone to bed, I poured a glass of wine and unfolded the second page, the real letter. Ellen, if you're reading this, then the truth has caught up to you, as it was always meant to. Rebecca was your mother's sister, the child my parents never claimed. Your mother loved her more than anyone, and I couldn't stand it. She asked me to bring her into the family business, to give her what she never had. I refused. That was the day your mother turned away from me. You may judge me for everything I've done, but remember this. Betrayal runs in our blood. Father. My hand shook as I set it down. Aunt, sister, hidden family. All those years Mom whispered on the phone, slipping into the garden so no one would hear, she hadn't been talking to a stranger. She'd been talking to her own secret. The next morning, I showed the letter to Smith. He read it twice, jaw tightening. So he hid another part of your mother's family. Maybe someone who knows what really happened to her money. Or someone he paid to disappear, I said quietly. He frowned. Do you want me to find her? I hesitated. Yes, but not as revenge. I just need to understand who my mother was before he broke her. Smith nodded. Within a week, his contacts traced a trail, bank transfers under the name R. Hart, all leading to a small coastal town 3 hours away. When we reached the town, it was quiet, almost untouched by time. Fishermen hauled nets along the shore, the sea air smelled like salt and memory. Smith waited in the car while I walked up to a small cottage near the cliffs. The door creaked open before I could knock. A woman stood there, her silver hair braided neatly, her eyes the exact shade of my mother's. You look just like her, she said softly. Rebecca? She nodded. You're Ellen. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind carried gull cries through the silence. Finally, she stepped aside. Come in. You deserve to know the truth. The cottage smelled like old paper and sea lavender. Photographs lined the mantel. My mother, younger, happier, her arm always around Rebecca. I didn't even know you existed, I said quietly. That was his doing, Rebecca replied. Your father didn't want me near her, or you. He said I'd ruin his perfect family. She poured tea, her hands trembling slightly. When your mother found out what he'd done with her inheritance, she begged me to help her hide part of it. For you. For when the truth came out. My breath caught. She hid money? Not just money, Rebecca said, sliding a small wooden box across the table. She hid her proof. Every lie, every signature, every document that tied him to the fraud. She wanted you to have it when you were ready. I opened the box. Inside were faded papers, old photographs, and one sealed envelope labeled, For Ellen, when you're free. That night, I opened it alone. My dearest Ellen, if you found this, it means the world has finally seen the man your father truly is. I'm sorry I left you in that house of wolves, but I knew one day your silence would become your strength. Never fight with their cruelty, fight with their truth. And when you stand before them, don't ask for justice. Become it. Tash, Mom. I pressed the letter to my chest, the words burning through me like fire and peace at once. For the first time, I felt her presence, not as a memory, but as a force. Smith found me crying quietly and didn't speak. He just held me until the shaking stopped. Over the next month, I used every piece of evidence from the box to finalize the case. My father's empire fell completely. His name was stripped from every building, every document, every memory that once defined us. Claire rebuilt her life quietly, volunteering for the same women's foundation Mom once supported. And I turned the lake house into something new. The Rebecca Foundation, for women silenced by power. On opening day, reporters gathered outside. They asked if I wanted to comment on the Mitchell scandal, if I felt vindicated. I looked straight into the camera and said, "Vindication is for people still living in the past. I'm building something my mother would have been proud of. That's my revenge." The clip went viral overnight, but fame wasn't the reward. Peace was. One evening, weeks later, Smith and I sat by the lake as the sun sank low. He took my hand, smiling faintly. "You did what no one else could, Ellen. You turned their cruelty into something beautiful." I squeezed his hand. "She taught me how." He nodded. "Your mother?" I smiled. "And you." We watched the last light fade across the water. For the first time in decades, the silence didn't hurt. It healed. Before bed that night, I opened the wooden box one last time. At the bottom, beneath the letters, was a small silver locket I hadn't noticed before. Inside was a photograph. Mom, Rebecca, and me as a baby, smiling together. And behind it, a folded scrap of paper. "Forgive him if you can. Forget him if you must. But never forget who you are." I placed it back gently, whispering, "I won't." Then I closed the lid. The box felt lighter. Maybe because I was. If you're still watching this, tell me, would you have opened that letter? Or left the past buried? Like this story and comment what you think was in your version of the letter. And don't forget, subscribe to Red Silk Revenge, where silence always finds its voice.